That's the legacy cellular networks for attacks that can be easily launched through demonstrable risks. And basically this is the purpose of the presentation. So we're going through a small introduction. People that aren't familiar with GSM, Gprs, and UMTS security, UMTS technologies, I'm going for a small introduction on each, showing you how the networks have morphed over time, basically how they built upon rusty radio networks and basically ended up in the third generation networks they have today. Everything big now, and look at some of the real GSM, Gprs, and UMTS risks. Some which I've released as advisories, some which will be new to this presentation. And then I'll begin to show some easy toys which we released last week, which I released to enable Symbian-based devices to allow people to access Gprs third generation networks, whether it's a Symbian handset, to find vulnerabilities in these networks and some of the very scary vulnerabilities that exist there. And then we'll dig down into some other areas of research which I think are applicable to FE security and also are very interesting research projects. If people have questions, they're free to interrupt. If you just hold on to the end, you can do that either. So basically what we want to look at is how cellular networks have evolved. We all see the big push now that these always-on data networks, the cab driver that drove me here today had a Gprs-enabled cell phone with GPS, and that's how he finds his routes. And we're going to look at what's happened in the last 5 years of server security, and then basically what that state been up to for the last 2.5 years in this. So how cellular networks evolved? We originated with AMPs in the UK, and the companies will be around UK technologies, being that's where I'm from. Then there were analog networks. Fraud was just unbelievable. You used to be able to get engineering firmware for your favourite handset, so you could listen to the phone calls, you used to be able to do a scanner. And those are some of the networks which are still deployed in certain parts of the US. We then moved on to GSM, obviously, which is a global system for mobile communication. It's time division multiplex based, and that's pretty much the standard that we've adopted as Europe and supporting nations around us. That provided 9600 boards, switch data, which was one. As everyone will testify, it was slow, it was basically dialed up over the network. We then saw certain vendors innovating, primarily Nokia, trying to pump out more speed, offering higher speed circuit switch data, offering a max speed of 28A, and we've just seen the recent upgrades offering up to 43K down. So this is kind of people understanding the capacities there in the network, and now computers and the switching systems have caught up, they can offer more bandwidth over these legacy networks, and it was a bolt-on. And then obviously we had the big revolution, which was Gprs, which was a packet-based radio service, introduced large IP networks into cellular providers, which historically they had not had to deal with. And this is where we have seen the largest exposure in any network. Forget the internet 10 years ago. Now on cell phone networks, from the end of a handset, we've demonstrated we can break in, we can break into the intercept, and we can see what wiretaps are on. Obviously that depends which country we're performing assessment in, but these are very real risks. Then we saw Edge, which was the enhanced data rate of GSM evolution. So basically they realised that the 3GPP lags were on their case and were going to suddenly whack them out of existence. They provided a bolt-on to Gprs, which provided similar to 3G bandwidth. It provided less than 3 times the capacity of Gprs. So this is some serious bandwidth now working on your cell phone. With the current per megabyte billing processes, I'm not sure how well they're taken off outside of operators and corporates for end users, but it's there to back. And then obviously finally, third generation UMTS, Universal Mobile Telecommunication System. The idea behind UMTS is today we may use cell phones, but the network infrastructure can remain the same, and it may be a satellite up and down, providing connectivity, etc., etc. So the radio interface is actually independent from the core of the network, and can be added in as technology moves on. And this was designed as a basis for operators that invest a lot of money into these networks. They don't want to have to keep investing. And that's using wideband CDMA. So that's using code division multiplexing as opposed to time division multiplexing. And here what we've seen now is IPv6 being introduced into these. And this is usually at OEM request as opposed to operators wanting to. So what has happened in the last 5 years? Once they were really switched, and by that I mean everything was out of band. From the end of your cell phone, you may be able to eavesdrop on, if you have microwave transceivers, you may be able to eavesdrop on base station to base station to BSC communication. But realistically, from the end of a handset, you're pretty isolated on the attacks that you can perform against the network. You may be able to target a specific user. Obviously in GSM we've seen fake base stations used for TIMSI and IMSI capturing. For example, the Dutch Secret Service use IMSI captures, and that's well publicised. It stops them having to get wiretap court orders. That's why they do it. We've seen location update spoofing, deregistration spoofing, and I would recommend that everyone read Emmanuel Gedix's paper on this that he presented at Black Hat in Black Hat Asia. It was very good on the specifics of GSM flaws, which in my book is old technology and we're moving away from it. So then they introduced IP networks, and historically these were a load of telecoms engineers that could wire trunks together and understood about routing calls, but they hadn't had to deal with deployments of large IPv4 and IPv6 networks. They didn't understand the concept of secure network design. Obviously the problem with cellular networks primarily is latency. So you saw people like Nokia, people like Ericsson, deploying solutions which weren't secure, but which were fast and were reliable. But the thing that suffered was security. They didn't understand secure application or product design or implementation, and this goes for both the operators and the OEMs, name your favourite one. Buffer, heap, format strings, all the vulnerabilities that we've seen out on the internet exist in cellular equipment today. And the thing that's restricting people finding them is people like you and I that have the knowledge or have the will to look for these types of vulnerabilities, getting access to the equipment in a labbed environment. Historically, when ATTAC has been involved with engagements, we've had live networks or semi-live networks. We've never been providing kit in a lab environment which we can seriously rip apart. So all of the vulnerabilities we found on production systems deliberately or by accident. And it is just a shambles, really. As you see throughout the network designs that I will go through, that everything from the end of a handset, you're only one hop away from the most sensitive parts of the network. It's just ideally you need to not go through that one hop. So, what have we been up to for the last 2.5 years? I released a white paper in July last year on Gprs security, not ready for prime time, and it listed in there 0 days, but no one appeared to realise that. We released the advisories a year later. It did talk about some of the horrendous mistakes that we were seeing. We've been trying to brief both OEMs and people like the GSM Association. But we've also been creating tools. We're spreading the knowledge here. So I released the WAP pen test kit, which was a very loose collection of very lame and quickly hacked together tools for playing with WAP gateways on GSM connections that allowed you, for example, to initiate a port scan from the operator's WAP gateway around its infrastructure. So from the end of a handset, I tell their WAP gateway to do port scan for me, and what they see, obviously it sits in the middle of their network and is semi-trusted, and thus it reaps a load of information which I would not otherwise be available to me. And we also proved with the WAP pen test kit that basically WAP gateways are like proxy servers. They just use different technology. They use WMA instead of HTTP. So all of the lame proxy tricks we've seen in the past, where if you know an RFC 1918 address inside the organisation and you can connect to it through their proxy, the same works again from the end of a handset. If you know their internal addressing scheme and you know sensitive systems, there's a chance that you will be able to, using their WAP gateway, communicate with those that obtain sensitive information. And then one of our newer tools is the mobile pen tester, which is to enable Symbian-based devices to actually assess these. which I'll show a demonstration of later. And we've been learning a lot. You know, there are new protocols. We've had to deal with Gprs tunneling protocol. We've had to deal with vendor plugins on existing protocols. There is just a wealth of new information, which in my opinion isn't readily accessible to those not in the know, and so that would be someone not working for an operator or a vendor. So, introduction into network design. Historically, this is what a GSM network looked like. So we had the handsets on the end, the air interface connected to the antennas, those were controlled by a PSC, and basically your call was routed as is your fixed line, etc., etc. Not very interesting. However, I would draw your attention to the devices on the far right, where the crown jewels, in my opinion, are held. You know, so we're looking at digital location register. We're looking at the home locator register, which store credentials about subscribers on the network, so that's visiting subscribers and active subscribers on their home network. And in addition, we have things like the authentication center, which will store all of the encryption keys which are used for your SIM, in Cleartext in our experience. And then things like the EIR, the Equipment Identity Register, which we've seen become more paramount in the UK as soon as they basically outlawed IMEI changing due to its potential use in crime. And then SMSC, so we had the Short Message Service Center, where we've seen in the past in the UK, the only instances of these being cracked and publicly identified is when there's been a rogue individual inside the network. Again, you have to ask, covered SMS to the death. So basically, the rough architecture of a WAP gateway looks very similar. It's just that the protocols go. So this is for WAP 1.2. We see going in WDP, WTLS. Any encrypted sessions which are going from the handset will then be decrypted at the WAP gateway and then re-encrypted with fatter common internet technologies such as TLS and TCP and UDP in their own right. So obviously the risk here is, should you find vulnerabilities in the WAP gateway, you can snarf any sensitive credentials going through that. And where again, any WAP pen tester, there are a number of zero-day vulnerabilities which no one seems to have realised in gateways which have never been fixed, and they allow you to reconfigure them, extract information, etc., etc. So then we moved on to Gprs network design. You'll see a lot of the components are very similar, such as like the master switching center, visitor location registrar, and home location registrar. However, we have this new tier of devices, the GGSN and SGSN. And this is where we saw IP connectivity introduced into the center or the core of the operator's network. This was the first time that they had routable addresses that provided both user connectivity, but also provided inter-device or inter-node connectivity within their own networks. And so we all exist on the same. And the problem here is that should you be able to get onto any of these IP networks, then potentially you can go anywhere you want. So this is a slightly clearer one. We see at the top where the user will have historically resided in a switched or just a voice telephony network. Down on the bottom where we've got SGSN, charging gateways, GGSNs, that's all IP connectivity. They give them funky network names like GB, GR, GI, GN, but in actual fact they're just IPv4 or IPv6 networks. So, an SGSN is a serving Gprs support node. As soon as your phone is handed off from the base station controller, it's handed to an SGSN, which then basically encapsulates your communication inside Gprs tunneling protocol to then, in theory, your home network. So if I establish to an SGSN on D2, that would route me back to Vodafone's GGSN in the UK. Obviously the GGSN is the demarcation point, so that's where mysteriously and miraculously all of my traffic gets decapsulated from GTP and is now standard IPv4 traffic. So I'm now free to roam in, and it could be considered the internet from here on in. CGSN initially saw certain cheaper OEMs trying to combine the functionality of both devices. The ramifications there were it wasn't particularly scalable. The vulnerabilities as they started coming out of CGSN actually had monetary impact for the operators. And then the crown jewels, the lawful intercept equipment, which is IP-based as well. So this will exist, as you'll see in the later diagrams, on one of the networks which is back from the user networks, but basically it holds all of the IP devices for lawful intercept. So if there is a warrant issued against your cell phone, that will be plugged into lawful intercept, and then it will poll the GGSN, all of your active IP traffic, and it will happen seamlessly, in theory. And then we have border gateways, so where operators have roaming agreements, or they have their own partners, that your traffic will go through a border gateway, and then charging gateways. Obviously, that's where historically CDRs would have been generated. The center is now an IP device that accepts CDRs from the GGSN. So obviously, if you can crack the GGSN, you can stop your account being good. So, just to give you a breakdown on some of the odd network names and what they actually mean. So, GI, that is where my sessions terminate. That's where I exist as a user. When I have an IP address in Q2 or Vodafone, that is on the GI network or on cloud within the GI network. The GN is a very private network that exists only between SGSNs and GGSNs. GR links, obviously, some of the items which we've never been able to see before, such as HLRs, VLRs, SMSCs, from the SGSN. So you can see where we're going here. We're going to go work our way back through the network and attempt to obtain access to the most important areas. GF, the interesting point to make about GF, as of 6 months ago, I wasn't aware of any vendor actually implementing this interface. So at the moment, if you have a Gprs only enabled handset, there is no way to report your handset stolen and have it locked down. The way they've got around that historically, at the moment, they're only shipping GSM and Gprs enabled cell phones. So they lock up your GSM, your IMEI on the network. And in theory, that can not provide you access to the Gprs network. As soon as we start seeing Gprs only enabled devices such as VoIP over Gprs and SMS over Gprs, it will be more difficult with the current vendor deployments. And then GB, that is the SGSN back to the base station controller. And then GRX, the Gprs roaming exchanges. We've all come familiar with the concept of internet exchanges, so like links in London. Operators have the same. They have their own private peering points where all of the Gprs networks will connect on Cable Wireless, Run 1, Deutsche Telekom Run 1, etc., etc. And these are basically where all of the operators will plug in and potentially implicitly trust any data that emits from them. And this is where one of the problems is resolved. So if we look at UMTS network design, we again see that a lot of the components that were introduced in Gprs are still there, but they've now basically changed the air interface. So we see RNS or RAN, the radio air network, it introduces IP connectivity from not only up to the GGSN where we saw it before, but it now goes all the way back to the base station. So what we saw in the latest release of the 3GPP standards is that the entire network can be IP. So you get into the network and you can go in. And to enlighten you, some of the radio area network controller equipment I've seen at the moment, which is actively being deployed in 3G networks, is NT4 Service Pack 608. That's serious. Don't even get me started on the fact that they're using NIS for all of the elements inside the network. This is the type of thing that we're seeing. Everything that we've learned not to do over the last 10 years in internet security, they seem to have torn up, forgotten about, and then started from scratch again. So they're going through the same learning process. So just some of the new acronyms that you'll want to be aware of. What was a mobile station is now your mobile equipment. Your RAN, obviously the radio network base station, and the RNC, the radio network controller. And this is, it's NT4 running WebLogic from about 3 years ago, OpenNet BIOS shares, etc., etc. So, what have we seen? We've seen cell phones and SIM poorly designed. Obviously in the GSM and Gprs world, SIM toolkit and MDXC flaws are not well documented in my opinion in the public domain. I was informed that SIM toolkit applications only have to be assigned with the same DES key. So if you can work out what DES key is, anyone can sign a valid SIM toolkit application and introduce it over the air via SMS. That's the type of stuff. They've forgotten about everything in relation to security. And their argument always is that we can add more security, but it's going to require a fan on the side of your phone to cool it down. Rather than looking at clever algorithms like ECC. Obviously, denial of service attacks via SMS, that is now becoming more commonplace. GSM, Gprs not having encryption. In a number of assessments I've done for operators, their argument has been is they don't have the scalability in their networks to offer encryption over Gprs, so they just turn it off. And one of the interesting things is part of the ETSI specifications is that if you have an unencrypted cellular connection, there is meant to be a visible identifier on your cell phone. So the way on a Nokia that you can tell if your connection is unencrypted is there will be a small padlock appear, an unlocked padlock appear above the signal strength. But I'm not aware of any other handset manufacturers that actually follow the ETSI specifications and inform you when your connection is unencrypted. And this is becoming more commonplace, as we saw in Russia. Sorry, yes.
Oh yeah, no, have you already seen this?
Just Microsoft.
Yes, I had a 6310i, yeah, and you can see the unlock padlock occur above the signal strength when your encryption is unencrypted.
And where was it?
I can't remember which country, I don't think I'd be able to tell you. I think it might be in Israel actually, because I was on a Western sim room, but I can't remember. And obviously, this brings paramount to the issue. Russia, I think, during the siege in the playhouse, ordered all encryption be turned off, all GSM communications, so they can monitor without having to go to the operators. So, you know, there are issues here of privacy for you as end users and security consultants, but also for individuals that aren't necessarily technically au fait, that governments can issue commands and directorates that will force networks to turn off encryption. We've seen poor encryption. Cellular, ETSI, GSM Association are renowned for developing their own cryptography, and then as soon as they leak or someone with a good enough background in statistical analysis gets hold of it and enough raw data, they break it. You know, they're not implementing commonly used encryption here. And then even today, with 3GPP and the 3G standards, what we've seen is recommended crypto to be used. I know of at least 2 operators in mainland Europe that have taken that and modified it for their own use. You know, so we don't know what they're doing here, whether or not they're introducing flaws, or whether or not they are indeed improving. Non-mutual authentication, this was a big issue, and this is where the GSM and Gprs, a lot of the attacks emanated from. The fact that I have to authenticate to the network, but the network never had to prove who it was to me. And that's where we saw all of the big base station attacks coming from people to steal IMSIs, so they could clone cell phones, steal TIMSIs, so they could clone a cell phone for a temporary basis, etc., etc. And I've seen demonstrations by one Malaysian service provider that actually cloned one SIM of theirs into 5 separate ones, and they wanted to test out both their fraud department's technology, but also their OEM or technology provider's technology, and they went to 5 separate places in the country and used all 5 phones simultaneously. And the only thing was that one phone could receive the incoming calls, and that was the one that was last turned on. But all of the others could make outgoing calls, originate SMS, etc., etc. Then when we got to black, poor software implementation, you know, they didn't read how to write secure code. They just, again, it was speed to market. And this is the big driver here in cell phone networks, speed to market. That will be, you know, the life or the death of you. And so they implement very poor code. You know, Nokia released a Java-based WAP gateway that you can reverse engineer with JAP to find all the vulnerabilities. There's a good example. As we saw with WAP, 1.2, if you crack the WAP gateway, you could seal the connections. In 2, basically, they ripped up the standard and implemented a standard internet proxy that does pass-through TLS or SSL connections. Then we move on to these more interesting networks, Gprs and UMTS. I demonstrated in the Nokia GGSN that I could denial or service it with 1 TCP packet from the end of a cell phone. Certain networks only have 10 GGSNs, 10 packets per network. It's that quickly. And that's with minor authentication. And that was only set in the TCP option to FF in the TCP packet header. Of course, the Nokia GGSN to kernel panic was shut down and required I'm glad to say that also affected all the Nokia Zipso-based platforms up until about 18 months ago. So anything that was firewall 1-based potentially was susceptible when any of the other VPN type devices they ship. So a good one to bear in mind. Cleartext Protocols. What we've seen is lawful intersect occurs over these networks via FTP or TFTP. So coming over these networks is requests to the GGSNs from the lawful intercept controllers in FTP or TFTP using hard-coded usernames and passwords, picking up every 3 minutes the data logs they need to pass. So if you get onto any point of the network and you can sniff traffic, you've got an account which you know you can log into any GGSN. Yeah, there's a good example. They use SNMP v1 everywhere. They use web everywhere. I don't think they even web SSL is. They haven't implemented it on any of the management interfaces. And Nokia have only relatively recently introduced SSH, but again, it's not by default. Operators have to request it to be deployed upon their equipment. On some of the Nortel kit, we found backdoor usernames and passwords that are coded into the platforms, which again were recovered by using JAD on the Java management interface. We found that there were 3 hard-coded usernames and passwords which were the sub-processes of the management interface. This is a great one. We did one assessment in one country and cracked the OEM's basically install account. We then went to another country, another operator, another family of operator, and used the same username and password to get into all of the devices. It seems like the professional service has been on a road trip around Europe. Used all the same usernames and passwords everywhere. And this was, this is operators when it's handed over, they don't change it, they just leave it as is. And as I said, old technology, NIS, in a 3G network, I saw this. There was a Solaris box which I could use YPCAT on to dump the 3,000 user accounts I think they had in it. And that guaranteed that I would have an account into every element on the network from the end of the handset. And then port design and deployment of networks. And this is revolves around the GGSNs, if I go back to my earlier diagram, which is where my user session terminates, which is far over on the right-hand side, in theory, most untrusted. They appear to leave the management interfaces open on the GGSN, on the GI network. So if you could work out what the IP address was of the GGSN, from the end of the handset you could tell that loop back into it. And the specification says that you should not be able to terminate into your terminating GGSN. It doesn't say about if an operator has 10 GGSNs that you can't terminate to the other 9. So you won't basically increment the IP addresses up until you find a valid GGSN. And then using not particularly intelligent tricks, we compromise the GGSN, we're there on the GI, we run Nokia's IPSO has TCP down set UID, which is very useful. You just crack a monitor account, electronic packet sniffer. The fact that they have the shadow password file, you are really amazed me. And their argument was that IPSO is not a multi-user operating system. Everyone that has an account on it is trusted. Some of my operator clients disagree with that, and I'll still discuss it. So, this is all the work I've done, but I wanted to lay some seeds here. I'm only one researcher working for one company, and and there are people out there doing bits and bobs, but there are no coordinated efforts. These are where I believe the next 0 days are. We are at Stake slowly looking at GTP, and we actually have a GTP fuzzer written now, but I believe that there will be a 0 day in GTP. And as soon as there is a 0 day in the Gprs tunneling protocol, you own the SGSN, you own the GGSN from the inside out. So as you saw FX demonstrated with packets that pass through routers and terminate at routers, you're going to be able to launch similar attacks against the Gprs on the 3rd generation network as well, from the end of the handset. One of the less intelligent GGSNs that I've seen implemented, we sent a GTP encapsulated packet across the network, arrived at the SGSN, was encapsulated in a valid GTP session. When it terminated at the GGSN, it inspected the header, GTP, decapsulate. It then inspects the header again and checks if that's GTP. Oh, that's GTP as well. Oh, I'll decode that now. And then it spits the packet out. So there's the potential here of nested attacks inside the protocol. SS7, ASN1, everyone remembers the SNMP vulnerabilities that came out. Everyone remembers that. As soon as someone applies the same ASN1 mindset to SS7, you own all signaling inside cell phone networks. Yeah, the game is over, the game is lost. You'll be able to do called teardown, called establishment, etc., etc. And especially now people like innovators such as Cisco are trying to mainstream or streamline operators' networks by employing SS7 over IP. SIP, IX, H323, not commonplace in your cell networks today, but they will be tomorrow. So find those 0 days now, and I guarantee you, I know of 1 0 day in SIP in one vendor's implementation already that allows me to get remote authenticated route from the network. There will be more, again, because people half understand which does it work, yes, ship it. If you could ever construct traffic from your phone in whichever way that would malform a CDR, so basically a call ticket, which is used for billing, and then that is parsed by the CDR billing systems, the rating, mediation, etc., etc. Potentially you can start compromising components outside of your direct line of sight and get them to tunnel back out the network too. Lick and lib, you know, again, what we've seen on the lawful intercept devices, if you get any account, you don't need to crack the user account in lawful intercept equipment. You just basically use find and file system, and the files are well readable. So you can read all of the tabs that are meant to be in place, you can read all the data that's been obtained already. And a lot of the stuff is just being archived off the tape and constructed someone's desk. And again, I expect many more 0 days to be found in web gateways and application servers, especially with the advent of MMS that we're seeing. Other vulnerabilities like the shell components. An operator will get sold by Ericsson and SGSN. It's Solaris 2.7, I believe, which hasn't been patched for 18 years. You know, that's all it is. But it's a black box solution. They can't lock it down, touch it, because it breaks their support agreement. So any 0 days which are found in just common operating systems impact these operators more than they impact any other end user, because they can't touch the kit. They have to find ways to mitigate the vulnerabilities around it. And that's pretty hard if someone wanting to GGSNs or one of the devices that a user has to communicate. And this is one I want to throw out because I believe it would work. Finding a buffer overflow using DTMF. So if you get something that accepts numbers, sit there and pump it with 300 zeros. See if it crashes. You might not be able to write a successful buffer overflow. If you've got a heap overflow, but basically you manage to say that the passcode you entered was right, you know, to the voicemail system, etc. That may be an interesting area to look at. And so that's one that I've sat down with some open source PABXs to have a look at. I think it's definitely an interesting area going forward. So what are they doing today? We have GCP aware firewalls from some vendors, NetScreen and Checkpoint have deployed them. It was interestingly though that Checkpoint had to release a patch to address the not GGSN issue, which by default it wouldn't have protected it, which I found slightly odd as something that was meant to be aware. What still needs to happen? OEMs. This is the Nokias, the Ericssons, the Siemens of the world, need to accept that they're not selling black boxes anymore. Once upon a time, they used to develop their own operating systems, they used to develop their own circuitry. Now they're just churning Reebok stuff with proprietary cards. They need to accept that they've moved away from their existing model and they're deploying vulnerable systems all over the place. Operators need to realize every operator we turn up with and we go, all we need is 2 Gprs cell phones with SIMs. And that'll be, we'll come back to you in 2 weeks. Every time we've popped up on their lawful intercept or their SGSN, you're going, how can you have done that? You know, our OEM said it was secure. And it revolves around the fact that operators don't understand what they have in place a lot of the time. You know, they go, that's a network, that works, that's revenue generated, we can't touch that. And that obviously has a real bearing on what they do. And obviously everyone must get rid of the clandestine approach to security that exists in telecommunications. You know, I'm all for free speech and getting information out there, but this is one of the worst industries in my opinion for doing that. They're very much like, you know, you're not part of our club, you can't have the information, which is very hard for independent researchers trying to do their job. So good starts, obviously. Certain OEMs now are responding to mine and others' research because they realise that it actually has a real impact on their networks, the more reliant they become on them. And especially as in a lot of countries they're considered national infrastructure, and so obviously due to the new anti-terrorism laws, their networks must stay open in the event of a catastrophe. So you can imagine the help pay is DOS, Gprs network, 1 certain OEMs obviously avoid us. And certainly, yeah, vendors are slowly ramping up security solutions designed for Gprs and 3G IP. One of the more interesting is from Cerberus, and they have a combined fraud detection network and IP IDS that can correlate. So if you see erroneous SSL traffic, it can correlate that potentially with erroneous IP traffic and tie it back to the same user. So there are some rather clever things coming out. And there was finally a public mailing list established to discuss these types of things. You know, I've for years searched around for mailing lists to discuss these things. GSM security mailing list, I didn't start it, an American company did, but I have got a number of operators and vendors to sign up. So it's almost like the bug trap or the full disclosure of the GSM or Gprs way. So when we look at some of the pragmatic assessment techniques, so if you actually want to go out there and assess the network, and I do say assess, obviously at stake, because we often don't remember otherwise. These are some of the tools that we used to use in the past that we've developed. So I'm going to start with a Nokia tool, Net Monitor, for GSM networks, just for finding out if the encryption's turned on, for example, and then going through some WAP and mobile pen testing kits. So this in Nokia Net Monitor was the screen that allowed you to see if encryption was on the network at a detailed level. This should also show you if the encryption is on, what actual algorithm they are using. And that can be useful if, for example, you have off-the-shelf encryption, such as A5 or something similar, that's just been had the whole shot. Is it any use? Well, you can see if there's any encryption is on. Features there are far more in Nokia Net Monitor, and too many to list here. But I would recommend getting the unofficial Net Monitor manual, version 0.8. It was the last version I ever saw before the guy disappeared. It was an Italian guy, I believe, that wrote it. It's very good, it's very comprehensive. Also, it should be noted that Nokia have removed the Net Monitor functionality from their Gprs phone because they're now selling that functionality to operators as a debug tool. So, that's the WAP testing toolkit. It allowed, what is it? It was WAP Finger, WSP Get, WSP Scan were the three tools, and it allowed you to do very basic fingerprinting of WAP gateways, and I've got most of them in there. I actually have got all the CMG ones in there now, which I didn't have for a long time. So we'll identify which WAP gateway is listening or running, and also any vulnerabilities that I'm aware of that's in it. And it was designed as a pen testing tool for us, the at-stake PSO, which we released open source, no license attached to do what we want. Is it any use? Well, yes, it was, because we demonstrated again to certain operators that we could break into their corporate networks or enterprise networks because their WAP gateways had connectivity to them. That was the old at-stake Gprs assessment platform, or GSM Gprs assessment platform, basically just a selection of phones, some Bluetooth devices, and a how-to on how to get the connectivity up and the types of things which you should look for in these networks. If anyone wants a copy, I'm quite happy to release it now because it's old and we don't use it. So email me and I'll gladly release it. Yeah, it discusses a number of vulnerabilities in depth that we discussed in the 2002 white paper, actually to a technical degree in regards to exploitation. So, the future. This was one of the first tools that I released, which was NetScan, which was designed for the Sony Ericsson P800, which is one of these Symbian-based cell phone Gprs devices, and it was a simple TCP port scanner. It was pretty cool. You know, the fact that I could turn up an operator, I didn't have to have a laptop and a cell phone. I could just turn up, go click, click, click. There's your GI network. I can see these services open. Do you want us to go any further? It was allowing me to cut my teeth on the Symbian development and very basically the functionality of a good start. The big brother is the mobile pen tester kit for Gprs, and this includes a netcat clone called PDA-CAT, NetScan. It includes a port of WAP scan over to it, so you can now do WAP gateways over Gprs networks, and it even has an HTTP vulnerability scanner as well, just in case you happen to trip across any web servers that you find on the operator's network. And this just runs off a text file, which you can update yourself, and I release updates on a monthly-ish basis. So, what we've done developing for 1.2, I had some requests from certain surprising organisations for tools to be included. And so I'm working on Traceroute, ICMP suite, TCP Unity suite, and a DNS digger for it. So my idea is that you will never need a laptop to access these Gprs networks now. You will just use your Symbian-enabled device. And if you have any ideas of things you'd like to see included, I'm all willing to incorporate them. These tools I release for free just because I'm allowed to. So, some of the other areas that I've been looking at as well, which I thought I'd tap on to the end of this presentation, are embedded flash file systems, some Bluetooth stuff I've been playing around with, some cell phone software that I haven't developed, but very interesting for people conducting research in this field. And it's a great learning tool for anyone who wants to kind of get down and learn how phones work. And VoIP, because we all know VoIP is going to arrive at some point, and it's going to be over cellular, and it's going to be mainstream. So embedded file system, embedded flash file system, basically through the standard Symbian interface, you're allowed access to, I think, 6 high-level directories like images, photos, etc., etc. All PDA does is it allows you to rip the entire Symbian file system into a removable Sony memory stick duo. So you can then put that in your card reader and analyze the file system to find any clever backdoors they've left or any other kind of silly mistakes that the apps that are loaded onto it are making. And I, for example, I know one vendor's email, they provide a POP3 SMS, MMS solution, and that stores all the debug logs that come off that service in its file system directory on the Nokia 800. So if someone steals your phone, they just flash the file system and they can see all the emails you've been reading over the technology. So it was a good first start anyway, and to throw something out there. Bluetooth and Red Fang. I wanted to get the first tool out there because I wanted to name it more than anything else. But basically it was a very low hanging fruit in Bluetooth, and you'll see I've got an example here of what we do. Features is slow, it's proof of concept it works, which is a miracle for my code. And it could support multiple Bluetooth devices due to Blue's Bluetooth implementation. So basically a demo. So here we see that just using a standard Blues to HEI tool, I can see 2 Bluetooth devices around me. I then configure one of them to be non-discoverable. So basically that's my Windows host and telling it to not answer broadcast requests. I then run the HEI tool and it disappears, so in theory it can't be found. However, I then run Red Fang and basically query the equivalent of its MAC address, which is Bluetooth address, which is only 6 bytes, which is 3 vendor, 3 device. You can find the device again. I'm aware of some person, and I don't know who it is, and if anyone knows, I'd be glad to find out, has written a wrapper to Red Fang that does much better seeding to speed it up, and he's got something like 20-fold performance out of it. So, some of the third-party tools with Bluetooth. If anyone has the money in their research budgets for Bluetooth protocol analyzer, I'd recommend you get it. The problem with a lot of the Bluetooth device implementations is the air interface is locked away from you and it's inaccessible from the software, so you're locked into the higher level type functions. Using tools like this, you can actually send malformed lower level Bluetooth packets and crashing devices. But for example, does anyone work for Ericsson here? Raise their hand. Since Ericsson, I found, since they've become merged with Sony Ericsson, they no longer support the Ericsson brand for mobile phones. The T39M has a buffer overflow in its Bluetooth device name. That if you have a device with a Bluetooth name of 256 bytes, it will cause a buffer overflow in the phone. Ericsson won't respond to me and they ignore me because this is a very support the phone, and it's their policy not to inform anyone when they fix a problem, which makes it very hard for me to release information. This is one of the coolest tools I've seen, called WinArm, and it was written by some clever guy, and it's an entire emulator for the DCT3 technology that Nokia developed. And what it allows you to do is load up firmwares from the Nokia phones into a software environment and debug them, trace them, etc., etc. The only thing is it's got stale since 2000. I'd love to see the author kind of ramp up to the DCT4 stuff, but I don't know where he is or where he's gone. But again, use Google, find it. It's over all of the usual kind of cell phone cracking sites, but it's a good research tool to understand how badly phone software is written. RCI, teaching you to suck eggs, great over Army code. Interesting project, cell phone, the XDA guys, some of the stuff they're doing in relation to JTAG. I would say anyone that has an embedded device that runs any technology, look for the JTAG feed and just see what you can do with it. I have done hardware assessments for a number of clients and located the JTAG ports, and I can bypass their Java signing, I can rip firmware which I wouldn't otherwise be able to get access to. Find a JTAG, the kingdom is yours. This is also, I don't understand German, so it's very hard for me to read this site. A lot of Babelfish goes on. But the Nokia reverse engineering project is very, very cool. So this guy sat down and basically said, okay, there's no information out there on how cell phone software is actually structured. And he sat down and he documented it all. And has actually proven some of, actually provided patches and showed you how to patch certain parts of the code to do some interesting things. So any German speakers out there, I'd definitely go to learn some DCT3 stuff, which is like the old 6210 handsets and everything before Gprs. But again, it's a great learning point. And this is the final one. This is a pet project of mine. Well, anything else? I like PABXs, I like telephony. Asterisk is a great open source PABX which can do anything. And in the UK, a number of us in the security fraternity have established our own private secure VoIP over IP network on the basis that the North Intercept will always be a failure because we're outside the realms of regulation. So, look to these types of things, learn how to protect your privacy. We even have POTS connectivity now, it's plain old telephone system connectivity. We bought a developer kit for like $50. You get a card, plug it into your phone system. People dial in one country, route across over VoIP to another country, it's great. So a very, very interesting tool. And also, I believe the code's there, it'd be a great platform for writing the first voice over IP assessment kit. I haven't seen any tools apart from Vomit, which are kind of security tools that are aimed at voice over IP, I believe, to kind of do aggressive voice over IP assessments. This code base would be a brilliant, brilliant stack. Anyway, I'm running far, far ahead of schedule, but I'm going to throw out some questions now, and I am around for at least today, so if people want to buy me a beer and talk, I'm quite happy, and also email. Any questions? Down the side. One.
Did you have a close look at the P800 and how it can be accessed from like inside the same cell? Can I connect to another P800 and just download the phone?
Typically inside Gprs networks at the moment, they don't implement handset to handset segregation. So what you can actually do is, even if they have a firewall on the internet, you can scan all the other devices connected to Gprs. And so, for example, one of the common ones to actually annoy people is sending straight UDP packets that has their source address, which has a large payload of response. Because they're built on per meg, when they're downloading 2 meg of crap just for the sake of it, it's their build. So this is a real problem. People disputing builds inside cell phone networks. So that's a common one, is that you find someone's laptop who's got one of the Nokia Gprs cards in and just pop the net parts. The P800 by default has no ports open on it, I'm sad to say. However, on the P800 you can introduce unsigned code, Java packages, via the serial port without any warning on the user interface, which did kind of concern me. Yeah.
You mentioned something about different worlds that the whole phone world is somewhat closed, and
Yeah.
their mindset is they are working on the security stuff and starting all over. At the same time, networks are merging, something like GSM application is used on W and stuff like that. So, are you seeing any reaction on the operators and developers?
Basically, they're accepting the risk. Basically, their prime goal is to earn money. They pay however much for these goddamn licenses. They just want to earn revenue. So we can point out the risks till we're blue in the face. We can demonstrate it, but they go, well, we'll kind of fund those fixes, but it's earning us money, so we can't take it down and re-architect it. So it's kind of, they're just going to bolt on more and more crap and have the same soft center.
Any differences between operators or the developers of the?
Certain operators are better than others, and I would say certain operators in mainland Europe are far better than those based outside mainland Europe. That's what I mean.
I mean, the mindset that do operators, are they more worried than developers, for example?
Yes, very much so. I actually had a call yesterday with one operator who's going, we know all the problems, we pen test our own kit, but we keep going back to our particular equipment manufacturer, and they go, well, you can't fix that, you'll have to wait till the next release, because they don't see it as Solaris 2.7, not patch rating. That's version 3000 of their GGSM. So you have to wait for version 3001 to get 6 of the 20 vulnerabilities that you identified fixed. You know, the fact that Ericsson have only just turned off all of the default TCP services in their GGSM is a miracle. They used to have Echo, etc., etc. It's hard. If anyone has any ideas on how to do it.
Have you actually seen already exploited operator networks?
Have I seen?
Networks of operators that have already been owned?
No, usually we are the ones doing the first argument, which we have. So I think after this presentation, we might have 7 in some cases.
I wonder if you have seen if operators update routes to your GSM without you knowing it, and it's really over here.
Sorry, I didn't understand the question.
I was wondering if operators can update GSM firmware over the air.
There are firmware not that I'm aware of, but they can like remove menus and the like using things like SIM Toolkit. There are certain administrative SMSs they can send, for example, to remove WAP functionality from your phone's menu.
I've seen it in the for the XDA.
For the XDA.
There is this action engine framework which states somewhere in the documentation that they can do this for the Windows CE part.
That's cutting edge, and I have to defer to the XDA guys. But you know, if that's the way it's going, I was aware of one manufacturer of a certain type of equipment relating to transport that was considering using Gprs, and they were going to be able to update the engine firmware in their transport over Gprs. You know, so that's the type of things we're seeing. Cool. Okay, well thanks guys for listening, you girls, and go and get beer, it's too hot.